Today we're going to begin Chapter 8 by taking the 8.1 subsection dealing with the business cycle. So what is a business cycle? Most of us have a general idea of what it is, and there are four parts to the business cycle. There's the peak, there's the contraction, there's the trough, and then there's the recovery. Let's go through each stage real quickly just to recognize by looking at our graph here what it's trying to tell us. Picture a situation here where you're at the peak of the business cycle, meaning that real GDP is at its highest, and then we start to slide downward toward a trough. During that period, we have what's called a contraction, also known as a recession. So as you can see in the graph, the economy is going down over time. As time on the x-axis moves forward, we see the real GDP is going down. That means the economy, of course, is contracting. It hits a trough, which by definition means it was the lowest part of that particular business cycle. Then you notice what happens after the trough. The economy recovers and starts growing. And it grows toward a peak, which of course is the end of the next business cycle, and then we start to slide downward into another contraction. So during the period from the trough up to the peak, we call it a business cycle expansion. So we have expansions followed by contractions, followed by another expansion, followed by another contraction. And that seems to be the pattern in capitalist economies. Now you notice through a two-step forward, one-step back process, you realize that even though there are contractions that follow every single business cycle expansion, thank goodness the contractions are smaller and shorter than the expansions. So therefore, over time, if you take the average, which is this straight blue line through here, that would be the long-term growth trend. So we see that the cycle goes up and down in the short run, but the ups and downs follow a long-term upward trend. Thank goodness that's true, because that means that in some future period, there will be some trough somewhere that's actually higher than previous business cycle peaks from a few generations earlier. And that's what we actually have seen in the United States, and not just the US. All of the advanced industrialized world, all of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, in the Far East, Korea, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, all the countries that have had economic growth have followed this kind of pattern where you go through ups and downs in the short run following an upward sloping long-term trend. Now, let's take a look at some particularly bad downward trends. Not the trend, of course, because that implies long-term, but short-run declines in the economy, what we called contractions. Now, of course, the greatest contraction in American history got relabeled as the Great Depression. We don't normally refer to recessions as depressions anymore because the scale it's just not comparable to what happened during the Great Depression. Take a look here at this particular graph at the green line. The green line is measuring unemployment. You can see the skyrocketing during the 1930s. Unemployment went all the way up to 25%. It came down during the mid-1930s, but you notice in 1937 it went back up again. So we had a recession within the Depression, and it went back up to 20% before finally coming down to roughly 15% by the end of the 1930s. It wasn't until the middle of World War II when a combination of the government both buying a tremendous amount of war material and drafting large numbers of young men and pulling them out of the workforce that we were able to get unemployment down to low levels again. So the Great Depression has triggered a massive rethinking of what's going on inside economics, especially at the macro level. Now, on this particular slide, we're going to take a look at roughly the same issue all over again, only instead of focusing on unemployment, we're going to focus on the business cycle of GDP. Remember, GDP we've already defined before, that's the total production of goods and services. Now you notice in this particular graph, on the y-axis, we're no longer keeping track of dollars of GDP, we're keeping track of percentage change of the dollars of GDP. So that's why you see that the long-term trend, this dotted line right along here, it's a horizontal line, not because the economy is horizontal, because if you have a constant growth rate, and you can see the number here is roughly 3%, that's been the average of all the ups and downs in the business cycle going all the way back to the 1930s, all the way up to the 2020s, has averaged somewhere around 3%. So if we were doing dollar numbers, of course there would be an upward trend because 3% more dollars every year is a bigger number of dollars. But if you're doing percentages, it's now a horizontal line. So now what we're going to see is the ups and downs around the horizontal line are the booms and the recessions, or rather the expansions and the recessions. So any of these lines you can see here during the Vietnam War, during the 1960s, you can see the economy was booming considerably above the 3% line. Down here, we're down below the 3% growth line. Whenever we get below this amber colored line, that's the zero line. The zero line, anytime you're below that, then of course you're in negative territory, and that means the economy is actually contracting. So let's just make sure that we read this graph properly. Take a look at this spot right here. This spot is on a downward slope. Is the economy in decline here? No, because remember, we're not looking at dollars of GDP. In the previous two slides ago, when we looked at the business cycle slide, if there was downwards movement, it would be an actual reduction of GDP. But remember, this is percentages. So at this point, we're sliding down from 5% growth to 3% growth to 2% growth. The economy is still growing. So the downward slope here means we're slowing the growth rate. So we're growing, but at a slower rate. It's only when we get below the zero line that the economy actually contracts. So you can see, going back all the way back to the 1930s, look at the size of this contraction. It's called the Great Depression for a reason. Compare this negative contraction to this one. This was the Great Recession that happened just recently in 2008, 2009, which we all talk about as, wow, what a terrible recession that was. Well, compare that one to the Great Depression. It's not even in the same ballpark, right? The Great Depression, thank goodness, is a one-off event so far and has never been repeated again. Now, this particular one right here, this particular recession was just the end of scaling down from World War II. And most economists don't treat this as a particularly important concept because scaling down from a war, making the conversion, getting all those soldiers back to work, you would expect there to be some kind of contraction in the economy. But you notice it immediately recovered, and then we've had some significant long-term growth. Last point on this, take a look at this one right here. Your author calls it a growth recession. A growth recession is it's a combination of two opposite words. Recessions mean the economy is declining. Growth means the economy is growing. What he's referring to here is, you notice that from these several years here, from 1985 up through 1987, the economy is growing at the average 3% that the economy has grown over a long period of time. Your author calls that a growth recession, meaning the economy is merely growing at its normal rate. It's not growing at above normal rates. But of course, it's not growing at below normal rates either. He calls that a growth recession. I think it's a strange use of language, but we're not going to argue. But this is obviously differences of opinion that everyone's permitted to have, what we should call these things. But clearly, the economy was growing and growing at 3% during this time period. The normal meaning of the word recession means the economy is actually in decline, that GDP is going down, not up. Now let's talk about macroeconomics here. Essentially, the main focus of macroeconomics is to try to explain why economies grow or don't grow, and why is there a recurring upward and downward movement in that GDP that we call the business cycle. So we're going to have three central questions that macroeconomists want to focus on. How stable is the market-driven economy? What forces cause the instability? And what, if anything, can government do to promote steady economic growth? Answering those questions has been what's been the mainstay of macroeconomics since the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression, most economists didn't think about this too much, and we'll explain why in the next slide. Prior to the 1930s, the conventional wisdom, because that's the experience, the conventional wisdom grew from actual practical experience, was that market-driven economies were inherently stable. Whenever a business cycle happened where you went from a growth phase to a recession phase, that recession phase was relatively short run. It would recover pretty much on its own with no government intervention whatsoever. Then the economy would start another expansion phase or growth phase. And then whenever some future recession would happen, again, it would be relatively short run and would naturally cure itself. So that was what most economists simply didn't take business cycle stuff too seriously, because since it was self-curing, why spend a lot of time thinking about it? The 1930s changed all that. The Great Depression was so deep and so long. It took over 10 years to get the unemployment rate back down to the normal level of 4 or 5% that we see in most economies. After studying that issue on unemployment in previous chapters, we realized that even full employment is not zero. It's around 4 to 5%, depending on how the economy is doing at that particular moment. So it took over 10 years to finally cure, quote unquote, the Great Depression. That triggered a major rethink of, should we be paying a lot more attention to these macroeconomic issues? So the laissez-faire doctrine, which was the previous doctrine before the 1930s, essentially economists advised the government, leave the market alone, it'll simply recover. Kind of like, what would a doctor do if you had a cold? Would a doctor decide to prescribe chemotherapy to you because you had a cold? No, they would say, take some over-the-counter remedies, pretty much just takes some rest, and it'll just simply cure itself. Don't make a big deal out of a cold. That's how macroeconomists treated the business cycle. We treated it like it was a cold until the Great Depression, which was more like pneumonia. Now, would a doctor say if you had pneumonia, oh, don't worry about that, just go get some bed rest, take some chicken soup, and you'll get over it? Well, that may not be the right approach for a pneumonia, right? And so that's my point. As an analogy, I want you to recognize that economists have now been rethinking the business cycle, trying to think about, is it merely a cold, or is it something more serious like a pneumonia? So the classical theory, this was the traditional theory up until the 1930s, was that the laissez-faire market economy was self-regulating, that it was self-adjusting, that wages and prices were flexible, so whenever you go into a recession, business people cut their prices, workers take a wage cut, the economy rebalances at a lower price, because as you all know from previous slides, at lower prices, people now feel emboldened to go out and buy new things because obviously you're getting a good deal. And then once people start buying again, then the economy naturally recovers on its own. So that was the classical theory, that the economy, even when it goes into a recession, has built-in mechanisms of lower prices and lower wages that would automatically start the rebalancing procedure and getting the next business cycle expansion restarted. And this comes from something called Say's law. Say, he's a Frenchman, so Say is a French name. Say was a famous French economist who came up with and discovered what's called Say's law. And Say's law can be summarized very simply as supply creates its own demand. If you remember from an earlier lecture we did, when we did the circular flow diagram, I pointed out that all production equals all income, because everything that's produced, when you sell it, by definition that money comes into the company, and then the company doesn't burn the money. They pay their workers, they pay for their materials, they pay for their factory buildings, and then whatever's left over they pay to their owners. Every one of the people who own factories, own businesses, or work in them are all in a household somewhere. So every single dollar of GDP naturally generates an income equal to that GDP. So Say pointed out that means there's enough money in the economy to buy up whatever the economy is producing. And therefore, the total demand is large enough to purchase all of the total supply, making the economy self-regulating. Now, of course, this mechanism somehow didn't seem to work during the Great Depression. And of course, this is why the Great Depression is so important to understand in American history. And of course, not just American history. The Great Depression didn't just happen to the US. It happened to most of the advanced industrial economies of the world. Most of Western Europe was also in the Great Depression during this time period as well. The economy did not self-adjust in the time period that we would normally think it would. In previous recessions, it had. Recessions would only last a handful of years, and the economy would quickly recover. During the Great Depression, we go on to a grinding recession that is so deep we rename it the Great Depression, and it lasts for 10 years. So at this point, John Maynard Keynes, a very famous English economist, comes up with the theory that economies are not inherently stable, they are inherently unstable. And it's government's duty to intervene in order to readjust the economy by changing the aggregate demand. And these are the kinds of things governments can do. Let's do the far left column first. So for an underperforming economy, John Maynard Keynes proposed the government either buy more output, that would give demand to factories, and then the factories would go hire more workers. So let's do a practical example. Let's assume that the military, or rather the government says, we're in the middle of a recession. We need workers to go back to work. Why don't we buy a whole bunch of munitions for the military and build another 100 miles of interstate highway? Now, obviously, if the government did those things, do you recognize that the firms who produce those things would have to go hire unemployed workers to go produce those things? So the theory would be the government would stimulate the demand by purchasing output. The government could directly employ more workers like they did during the Depression. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, is a very famous example where the government went out and hired a bunch of unemployed young men and then built the Appalachian Trail. That was one of the things that they did, among others. But that was a very famous thing, that the Appalachian Trail didn't exist, so we just put a bunch of men to work doing this, and that lowered the unemployment rate, put money in people's pockets, they were able to spend, and then hopefully it would start to regenerate the economy. The government could provide more income transfers. What this means is unemployment insurance could be increased or lengthened so that people who were unemployed and couldn't find work, instead of withdrawing from the spending stream because they have no money, if they had unemployment checks, they could continue to buy things, and that would give businesses a reason to start rehiring workers. And then last but not least, make more money available. This refers to printing more money through the Federal Reserve System, which we will, when our next set of slides, next chapter set of slides, we'll get into a lot more detail on that point. And then, of course, if the economy is growing too fast or expanding too fast, the government could do the exact opposite. That's the third column, the second column. I'm not going to read through each one of them. You can just check them out on your own, but they're simply moving in the opposite direction of the first column. So the government can slow the economy down if the economy is overheating.